At 66 years old, I sat at my own kitchen table and watched my wife slide a deed across the wood toward me, telling me to sign away 4 generations of Hollister land. The pen was already there uncapped, laid across the paper, like it had been waiting for me my whole life. Nadine had set it at an angle so the point aimed right at my hand. She always did think about things like that. The angle of a knife, the temperature of a room, which words would cut and which would soothe. "It's just a formality, Earl," she said. Her voice was soft as cream. "Vernon already had the lawyer draw it up clean. You sign and none of us have to worry about the farm anymore, about your hands, about any of it." She glanced down at my hands when she said that. My knuckles are swollen. The arthritis took the steadiness out of them years ago, and on a cold morning I can't hold a coffee cup without it rattling in the saucer. Nadine had built a whole story out of those hands. A shaky old man. A man who couldn't be trusted to run a dairy anymore. A man who ought to be grateful somebody younger wanted to take the burden off him. Standing behind her chair, one hand resting easy on her shoulder, was my stepfather, Vernon Pike. 74 years old and still handsome in that silver fox way that made women at church whisper. My mother married him when I was a grown man already, so we never played father and son, not really. But he'd called me son for 40 years, and I'd called him Vernon. And somewhere in the last 2 years, he'd been calling my wife something else entirely in rooms I wasn't supposed to know about. He smiled at me. A warm, patient smile. The kind you'd give a child who's finally about to do the sensible thing. "Take your time, Earl," Vernon said. "No rush. We're all family here." Family. He said it like a man laying down a winning card. I want you to understand something about that word coming out of his mouth. For 40 years, I had trusted it. When my mother married Vernon, I was already a grown man with a wife and a mortgage and cracked hands from working the parlor every dawn. I didn't need a second father. But Vernon had a way about him. He'd show up at branding time and roll up his sleeves. He'd sit on the porch and listen to me talk about milk yields like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. He remembered birthdays. He gave good advice. When my first wife passed, it was Vernon who sat with me on the worst nights. So when he said family, part of me still wanted to believe it, even knowing everything I knew. That's the cruelty of a man like Vernon. He doesn't just take your land. He makes you grateful while he does it. Across the table, my daughter Bryn wouldn't look at me. 24 years old, my youngest, and she sat there studying her fingernails like they held the secret to the whole world. She'd already picked her side, I knew that. She thought her daddy was a stubborn old fool who'd rather sink into the mud with his cows than let the family finally get something good. It's a hard thing, watching your own child wait for you to lose. Bryn used to help me turn the cheese wheels in the cellar, standing on an overturned bucket to reach the high shelf. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided I was the past and Vernon was the future. I don't blame her even now. She was young, and they'd promised her things. I'd learn exactly what things soon enough. And in the corner by the window stood the notary. A soft man in a gray suit that Vernon had brought with a stamp and an ink pad and a folder full of papers. He was ready to certify the moment my pen touched the line. They all thought they were watching a surrender. I looked at the deed. I looked at Nadine's soft, patient face, the face I'd once believed I would grow old beside. I looked at Vernon's easy smile. I looked at my daughter's bowed head. And then I picked up the pen. My hand shook. Of course it shook. It always shakes. But I held that pen steady enough, and I brought it down to the paper, and I signed my name. Earl Hollister. The same signature my father taught me to write when I was 7 years old, sitting on his knee, in a barn that smelled of hay and warm milk. Nadine let out a breath she'd been holding. Vernon's smile widened just a hair. The notary reached for his stamp, and I smiled back at them. I smiled, because they had no idea what they had just done. They thought they'd finally worn the old man down. They thought the papers on that table were the end of me. They weren't. Not by a long way. Because those papers were forged before I ever sat down and I knew it. And down in my aging cellar behind the racks of cheddar wheels I'd been turning since before Bryn was born, I'd been keeping something for 3 months that was going to bury every last one of them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. A story like this, you can't just crack it open and expect it to be good. You have to let it age. My name is Earl Hollister. I've spent my whole life making cheese. Not the shrink-wrapped orange stuff they sell in the gas station. Real cheese. Raw milk cheddar and aged Gouda and a farmhouse Alpine style my grandfather brought over from the old country. Aged 18 months minimum in a limestone cellar my great-grandfather dug by hand into the hill behind our house. 4 generations of Hollisters have milked cows in this valley in Tillamook County, Oregon, where the rain comes off the coast in gray sheets, and the grass grows so green, it looks like something out of a dream. I know cheese the way some men know scripture. I know that the best things in this world can't be hurried. You can't rush a cheese. You put it up on the shelf, you salt it, you turn it, and then you wait. You wait through the mold and the funk and the long, quiet dark. And if you're patient, if you don't crack it open too soon just because you're anxious to see what's inside, one day you pull it down and it's transformed into something worth more than gold. Most men my age are impatient. They want the payoff now. Vernon was that kind of man I'd come to learn. So was Nadine. But me, I'd spent 50 years learning how to wait in the dark while something ripened. That patience was the one thing they never accounted for. They looked at my shaking hands and my quiet ways and my worn-out boots, and they saw a man who was already finished. They should have looked closer. 3 months before I sat down at that table and signed my name with a smile, I found the first thing that told me my wife wasn't my wife anymore. It was a Tuesday in September when I found it. I remember because Tuesday is the day I bottle the week's cream, and my hands smelled of butterfat when I picked up Nadine's jacket off the mudroom hook. She'd asked me to grab her phone charger from the pocket, that was all. A simple thing a husband does for his wife. But when I lifted the jacket, I caught a smell that didn't belong. Cologne. Expensive cedar and something sharp underneath. Not mine. I've worn the same drugstore aftershave for 30 years, the kind in the white bottle, because Nadine once told me she liked it. This was a different animal entirely. I stood there in the mudroom, holding my wife's jacket to my face like a fool, breathing in another man's smell. And I told myself 100 sensible things. She'd hugged someone at the feed store. She'd stood too close to a stranger at church. There were 100 innocent ways a smell gets onto a jacket. But I've spent my life trusting my nose. A cheesemaker lives and dies by what he can smell. I can walk into my cellar and tell you which wheel has gone wrong before I ever lay a hand on it. And every honest instinct I had was telling me that this smell was wrong and that it had been in my house close to my wife more than once. I didn't say anything. That's the first thing you have to understand about me and about how this whole story went the way it did. My whole life, when something's troubled me, I don't blurt it out. I take it down to the cellar of myself and I let it sit. I turn it over. I wait to see what it becomes. So I hung the jacket back on the hook. I brought Nadine her charger. I kissed the top of her head where she sat at the kitchen table doing the farm's books, and I said nothing at all. The books. That's the second thing I need to tell you about, because it matters more than I understood at the time. For most of our marriage, I kept the books myself. Every gallon of milk sold, every feed bill, every repair to the old bulk tank. I did it at that same kitchen table, with a ledger and a calculator, the way my father did, and his father before him. It's slow, but I trusted it, because I could see every number with my own eyes. Then about a year and a half back, Vernon started coming around more. And one evening he sat down next to me, while I was hunched over the ledger, squinting, and he said, "Earl, your eyes are getting tired. Your hands hurt. Why are you torturing yourself with this? Let me set you up on the computer. I did the books for a trucking outfit for 20 years. I'll take this weight off you." I want to be honest with you. It felt like kindness. It felt like exactly the kind of thing a man does for family. My hands did hurt. The numbers had started to swim. And here was Vernon, patient and capable, offering to carry a load that had gotten heavy. So I let him. God help me, I handed him the books. I gave Vernon Pike access to every account the farm had. The operating account, the equipment loan, the line of credit at the Tillamook County Farm Credit Union that 4 generations of Hollisters had kept in good standing. I gave him my account numbers, my routing information, and worse than all of it, I sat there while he watched me sign checks and papers, learning the exact shape of my signature. That slow, shaky scrawl my father taught me. At the time, it felt like relief. Later, I would understand it was the first stone he pulled out of my wall. I've turned that evening over in my mind more times than I can count. The way he slid the ledger toward himself. The way he clicked his pen and started entering my life into his computer, column by column. He never once looked greedy. That's what I've had to make peace with. A greedy man you can see coming. Vernon looked like a son helping a father. He looked like love. And I handed him the keys to everything my family had built, and I thanked him for taking them. But I'm getting ahead again. Back to that Tuesday in September. After I smelled the cologne, I started paying attention. Not loud, not accusing, just watching the way I watch a cheese I'm not sure about. And once I started watching, I couldn't stop seeing. Nadine's trips to the farmer's market over in the next county started running long. She'd leave at 9 and come home at 4 with a single bag of tomatoes she could have grown in our own garden. Her phone, which used to sit face up on the counter, now lived face down, and it buzzed at hours no farmer's market ever kept. She started locking the bathroom door when she showered, something she hadn't done in 9 years of marriage. Little things. Any one of them meant nothing. All of them together meant everything. That's how you read a cheese, too, and how you read a marriage. Never one sign, always the pattern. And she got kind. That was the strangest part, and the part that hurt the most. She started being gentle with me in a way she hadn't been in years. She'd touch my shoulder when she passed. She'd ask how my hands were feeling. At first I thought maybe we were finding our way back to something. Now I know it was guilt. Or worse, it was strategy. A person who's planning to take everything from you will often be very sweet to you first. They're softening the ground. They're making sure that when they finally slide that paper across the table, you'll be too grateful for the kindness to look hard at the ink. I didn't know all that yet, standing in my kitchen that September. I only knew what my nose knew. That something in my house had gone wrong, quiet and slow, the way milk sours before you can taste it. I could have confronted her that night. Plenty of men would have. Plenty of men would have thrown that jacket on the table and demanded a name. But I'm not a plenty of men kind of man. I'm a cheesemaker. And a cheesemaker knows that the worst thing you can do when you suspect something's turning is to crack it open too soon. Open it too early, and all you've got is a mess and no proof of anything. No. If something rotten was growing in my house, I was going to let it grow until I could see exactly what it was. Until I could hold the whole shape of it in the light. So I waited. And 2 weeks later, on a gray Sunday afternoon, I found out who the cologne belonged to. And when I did, I had to grip the edge of my own workbench to keep from going down. That gray Sunday, Nadine told me she was driving out to the next county to see an old girlfriend. I nodded. I'd learned by then that nodding bought me more truth than asking ever did. But I didn't stay home. For the first time in my life, I followed my own wife. I felt sick doing it. A man shouldn't have to trail his wife down a highway like a hired detective. But I needed to see with my own eyes because a nose isn't proof, and my whole plan, though I barely had a plan yet, depended on knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I hung back 4 or 5 cars. She didn't go to the next county. She went 20 minutes down the coast road to a motel called the Sandpiper. A low gray building with a gravel lot and a view of nothing. She parked around the back, where the road couldn't see. I pulled off onto the shoulder a 1/4 mile up, and I waited. The way I always wait. A pickup was already parked back there. I knew that truck. I'd ridden in it 100 times. Silver with a dented tailgate and a rack of elk antlers bolted to the grill. It was Vernon's. I sat on that shoulder for a long time and watched my stepfather step out of a motel room and hold the door for my wife, and put his hand on the small of her back the way a man does when he owns a woman. and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. My mother's husband. The man who sat with me the night my first wife died. The man I'd handed my books to. The man my children called Grandpa. I want to tell you I was surprised. But underneath the shock, some old animal part of me had already known. That's what the cologne had been telling me for 2 weeks. My mind just hadn't been willing to say the name out loud. I didn't get out of my truck. I didn't march across that gravel lot and pound on the door. Every muscle in my body wanted to. I'm not a violent man, but in that moment I understood how violence happens, how it lives in the hands of a decent man when he's pushed far enough. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, and I made myself breathe, and I asked myself the only question that mattered. What do I actually want? Because here's the thing. I could have ended it right there. I could have divorced her. I could have called Vernon out in front of the whole county and shamed them both. That would have felt good for about a day. But I knew Nadine. And I was starting to understand Vernon. This wasn't a fling. A 74-year-old man doesn't rent a motel room by the coast road with his stepson's wife for the thrill of it. Vernon wanted something. And the only thing I had worth wanting was the land. 240 acres of Tillamook bottomland, worth more to a developer than 4 generations of my family could imagine, sitting in the name of an old man with shaking hands. If I confronted them now, I'd lose the marriage. But I'd never see the whole shape of what they were planning. And a half-seen thing can still hurt you. If I blew it all up today, Nadine would cry and play the victim, Vernon would vanish clean, and I'd be the bitter old man who couldn't keep his wife sitting alone on land they'd find some other quieter way to take. Bryn would never believe me. My own daughter would call me a jealous fool. No. I thought about my cellar. I thought about the wheels aging in the dark, and how the worst thing you can do is open one too soon. So I made a decision on the shoulder of that coast road that changed everything. I decided I would say nothing. I would smile. I would be the tired, grateful, agreeable old man they already believed I was. And while they thought they were reeling me in, I would document every single thing they did until I had the whole rotten shape of it in my hands, sealed and proven impossible to deny. I want to be honest with you about that decision because I've had people hear this story and tell me they'd never have the patience. That they'd have thrown the plate, made the scene, gotten it off their chest. And maybe you're one of those people. Maybe right now you're thinking, Earl, you old fool. Why didn't you just confront her? Why let it go on? I understand that. I do. There's a kind of honor in the loud way, but I'll tell you what I've learned in 66 years. The loud way makes you feel better and changes nothing. The quiet way costs you everything in the moment and wins you the war. I'd rather swallow my pride for 3 months and keep my family's land than shout for one satisfying afternoon and lose it forever. But I won't pretend it didn't cost me. That drive home was the longest of my life. I had to pass Nadine's car still parked behind that motel. I had to walk back into my own kitchen and act normal. And that night when she came home smelling of that cedar cologne and kissed my cheek and asked how my day had been, I said, "Quiet. Just the cows." And I smiled at her. That was the first lie I ever told my wife. And once I'd told it, I understood I was capable of the whole long game ahead of me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside a woman I no longer knew, listening to her breathe, and I planned. I couldn't do this alone. My eyes were tired and my hands shook, and I didn't understand computers or cameras or the law. I needed help. Someone I could trust with my life, because that's what I'd be handing over. There was only one person in the world who fit. My son. My oldest boy, Caleb, 29, steady, quiet like me, working a spread 2 valleys over, but home most weekends. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I drove out to Caleb's place with 2 thermoses of coffee and a story I'd never said out loud. I found him in his barn, and I sat him down on a hay bale and I told him everything. The cologne, the motel, Vernon's truck, his grandpa and his stepmother. Caleb went very quiet. Then he said something that told me I'd chosen right. "Dad," he said, "I've had a bad feeling about Vernon for a year. I just never had a reason." What do you need me to do? And that was the moment the two of us started building the thing that would bury them. We built it slow. That was the whole art of the thing, and it went against everything a father wants to do when someone's hurting his family. Caleb wanted to move fast. That first morning in his barn, once the shock wore off, the fear turned to anger the way it does in the young, and he was ready to drive straight to that motel and drag his grandfather out by the collar. I put my hand on his arm. "Son," I said, "listen to me. If we swing at them now, we miss and they see us coming. From this day on, you and I are the two dumbest, happiest, most trusting men in Tillamook County. You love your grandpa. I love my wife. We probably don't suspect a thing, you understand?" He didn't like it. But he was his father's son, and he understood patience even when it burned him. "All right," he said, "we play dumb. But we don't do nothing." "No," I said. "We do everything. We just do it in the dark." So here's how we worked it. Caleb had gone to a community college for 2 years before he came back to farming, and he knew computers and cameras the way I know curd. He set me up with a little email account nobody knew about, and he showed me how to photograph a document with my phone and send it to a place called the cloud, where it would sit safe even if someone took the phone right out of my hand. And we needed a place to keep the physical things. The originals. The paper. There was only one place in the world I trusted for that. My aging cellar. You have to understand what that cellar is to me. My great-grandfather dug it into the limestone hill behind the house with a pick and a mule in 1911. It stays 54 degrees year-round, wet stone, cool, dead quiet. The walls are lined with plank shelving, and on those shelves sit the wheels, some of them aging 18, 20, 24 months, wax-rinded and patient in the dark. Nobody goes down there but me. Nadine hated the smell, the mold, the damp. In 9 years of marriage, she'd been down those stairs maybe twice. Vernon never once. To them it was just the old man's hobby hole, a cold room full of stinking cheese, which made it the safest vault in Oregon. Back in the far corner, behind a rack of cheddar I'd set to age 2 years, there was a gap in the stone where a shelf bracket had pulled loose decades ago. I'd never fixed it. Now I lined that gap with an old lidded crock, the kind we used to brine in, and that crock became the heart of everything. Into it went a fireproof document bag Caleb bought with cash 2 towns over. And into that bag, one piece at a time, over the weeks that followed, went the evidence. Bank statements I printed at the library, not at home. Photographs of Vernon's truck at the motel, time-stamped. A little voice recorder Caleb showed me how to run, no bigger than a stick of gum. Copies of every farm document I could still get my hands on, so I'd have a clean original to compare against whatever forgery they eventually produced. Every Sunday while Nadine was off seeing her girlfriend, I'd carry the week's findings down the cellar stairs, tuck them in the crock behind the cheddar, turn a few wheels so the shelf looked worked and normal, and climb back up into my life as the trusting old fool. Then I'd make Nadine dinner and ask about her day. It's a strange thing, loving a place and a craft so much that it becomes your weapon. But that's what the cellar was. 50 years I'd spent learning to keep things safe in the dark until they were ready. Now I was doing it with the truth. Caleb and I met like spies. Never at the house. We'd talk on the phone about cattle prices in case anyone was listening, and slip the real words in between. The North pastures coming along meant we had new evidence. Weather's holding meant nobody suspected us. It sounds foolish, 2 dairymen talking in code, but you'd be surprised how careful you get when your whole life is on the table. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the acting. Every day I had to look at Nadine across the breakfast table and be gentle back. Every Sunday dinner I had to shake Vernon's hand and call him by name and let him clap me on the shoulder and ask in that warm voice of his, "How you feelin', Earl Hand's giving you trouble?" And I had to say, "Some days. Getting old, Vernon," and watch the satisfaction move behind his eyes. But the thing that cost me most, the thing I still can't talk about without my voice going, was Bryn. My daughter turned against me in those weeks, and she did it out loud. It started small. She'd come by the house and take Nadine's side in every little thing. Then one evening she sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd later sign, and she took my shaking hand in both of hers, and she said, "Daddy, I love you. That's why I have to say this. You can't run this place anymore. Your hands, your eyes. Vernon says you're one bad winner from losing everything, and he'd know. He did books for years. Maybe it's time to let people who love you take care of things. People who love you." I looked into my little girl's face, the face I'd watched come into this world, and I saw that she believed every word. She wasn't lying to me. She'd been lied to, and she was passing it along like a gift. I almost told her right then. The words were in my mouth. Your grandpa is sleeping with your stepmother, and they're trying to steal your inheritance. But I looked at how completely she trusted them, and I knew she'd never believe me without proof. She'd run straight to Nadine and warn them, and 3 months of work would burn. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I squeezed my daughter's hand and I said, "I'll think about it, sweetheart. Maybe you're right." And I watched relief and pity wash over her face. Pity for her poor, old, failing father. And I let her believe it. That night, I went down to the cellar, and for the first time in the whole business, I sat on the cold stone floor between the shelves, and I wept. Not for the land. Not even for the marriage. For my girl who'd been turned against me so smoothly she thought she was saving me. Then I dried my face, turned the wheels, checked the crock, and climbed back up the stairs. Because grief is one thing, and the work is another, and I had a war to win. What I didn't know yet, kneeling on that cellar floor, was that Caleb had just found the first hard proof that this was bigger than a marriage and a lie. He'd followed Vernon on a Tuesday, and Vernon hadn't gone to any motel. He'd gone to meet a man in a suit standing in the middle of my north pasture with a set of rolled-up plans. Caleb told me about the man in the suit that same night out behind his own barn, where no one could hear both of us, leaning on a fence rail in the dark. He'd taken to following Vernon on Tuesdays, when Vernon told the family he was driving to the VA clinic in the city for his knee. Turned out the knee was fine. That Tuesday, Vernon's silver truck rolled right past the clinic exit and kept going out the county road and turned up a gravel track that dead-ended in my own north pasture, the flat, rich bottomland along the creek where I run my heifers in summer. There was a black SUV already waiting. A man got out. City clothes, soft shoes, wrong for a pasture. A tube of rolled paper under his arm. Caleb parked far off behind a stand of alder and used the zoom on his phone, and he got it all. Vernon and the stranger unrolling those plans across the hood of the SUV, pointing. Vernon nodding, sweeping his arm across my land like it was already his to sell. Caleb showed me the photos on his little screen there in the dark. My hands started to shake worse than the arthritis ever made them. Because I could read enough of that rolled-up plan, even in a phone photo, even in the dim, to see what it was. A subdivision. Lots and streets and cul-de-sacs laid right over my pasture, like a net thrown over a running deer. Somebody had already drawn houses where my heifers graze. Somebody had already given my creek a fancy name for a sales brochure. "I got the plate on the SUV," Caleb said quietly. "Ran it through a buddy at the county. It's registered to a development company out of Portland. Cascade Ridge Holdings. They buy up farmland and turn it into these big neighborhoods. They've done it to 3 dairies in the valley already." So now I understood the whole size of it. This was never really about Nadine at all. Not to Vernon. A man his age doesn't chase a woman across a motel parking lot for love. He chases her because she's married to 240 acres that a Portland company will pay millions for. And she's the softest way in. That was the night I first began to suspect the thing that would turn out to be the sharpest twist of all. But I'm not ready to tell you that part yet. Let me tell you how I came to suspect it, because it started with something small. The following Sunday, I did something I'd never done. I bugged my own kitchen. Caleb set the little recorder inside the hollow base of a ceramic rooster Nadine kept on the windowsill, a gaudy thing her mother had given her that she'd never part with. It had sat there for years. Nobody looked at it twice. Now it listened. Most of what it caught was nothing. Dishes, the radio, Nadine on the phone with Bryn. But one evening, when Vernon came by to help with the books, and I made a point of going out to the barn for an hour to give them room, the rooster caught a conversation that told me more than all the bank statements combined. I sat in my truck that night, with Caleb one earbud each, and we listened. Nadine's voice, low and nervous. I don't like lying to Bryn about how much. If she knew the real number, she'd want a bigger share and she'd fight for it. Then Vernon's voice, smooth as always, but with an edge I'd never heard him use at the dinner table. That's exactly why she doesn't know the real number. Nobody knows the whole number but me, Nadine. That's how these things stay clean. You keep your part, you don't ask about mine, and everybody walks away happy. A pause. Then Nadine softer, almost pleading. You'd never cut me out, would you, Vernon? After everything? After what I've given up for this? And Vernon warm and reassuring, in that voice I'd trusted 40 years. Come here. Of course not. You and me, we're a team. It's you and me all the way to the end. Caleb pulled his earbud out and looked at me. He's lying to her dad. You can hear it. I know, I said, because I could hear it too. I'd heard Vernon lie to me in that same warm voice for a year. I knew the sound of it now, the way you learn the smell of a wheel that's gone bad, under a rind that still looks fine. He'd told Nadine, it's you and me all the way to the end, in the exact tone he'd used telling me, we're all family here. Nobody knows the whole number but me. That's how these things stay clean. Nadine thought she was Vernon's partner. She thought they were building a future together on the ashes of my marriage. But I'd just heard the truth in his voice, plain as a cracked bell. Vernon Pike didn't have a partner. He had a tool. And when a man like that is done with a tool, he doesn't share the profit with it. He sets it down and walks away. I didn't feel triumph hearing that. You'd think I might have, knowing my betrayer was about to be betrayed in turn. But I mostly felt tired and a little bit sick and something I didn't expect. A thin, unwelcome thread of pity for the woman who'd wronged me. Nadine had given up her marriage, her stepdaughter's respect, whatever was left of her good name, all to stand beside a man who was already planning to leave her holding the empty bag. I want to be clear. That pity didn't change my plan. She'd chosen this. She'd lied and schemed and turned my own daughter against me, and I owed her nothing. But I filed the feeling away because I've learned that a man who feels nothing for his enemies eventually stops feeling anything at all. And I didn't want to become the kind of man Vernon was, no matter what he'd done to me. Here's what I decided instead, sitting in that truck. I wasn't just going to protect my land and expose their scheme. I was going to make sure that when it all came down, it came down in the right order so that Vernon's own trap closed on Vernon too. If he wanted to cut Nadine out, fine. I'd let him. I'd time the whole thing so that by the time she understood what he'd done to her, the only person left standing with clean hands and a clear title would be me. But all of that depended on one thing I still didn't have. The forgery. The paper. Because everything Caleb and I had caught so far, the motel, the pasture, meeting the roosters recording, proved an affair and proved bad intentions. It didn't prove a crime. For that, I had to wait for them to make their move. I had to let them believe I was ready to sign. And 2 weeks later, over Sunday dinner with Bryn beaming and Vernon carving the roast like the head of the family he intended to become, Nadine set down her wineglass and said the words I'd been waiting 3 months to hear. Earl, honey, we need to talk about the future of the farm. Vernon's had some papers drawn up. Nothing to worry about, just to make things easier on you. Papers, I said, keeping my voice as flat and mild as buttermilk. What kind of papers? Vernon set down the carving knife with the roast half sliced, and he wiped his hands on the good linen napkin, like a man settling in to do something important. That was his way. He never rushed the pitch. He built the room first. Nothing scary, Earl, he said. Power of attorney, financial side only. It just means if your hands ever get too bad to sign a check, or if you have a spell, somebody's already authorized to keep the lights on and the bills paid. I've seen it happen to good men. A stroke, A fall. Farm goes under in 6 months because nobody could touch the accounts. Bryn nodded along like he was reading from scripture. Daddy, it's just protection. Vernon explained it to me. It doesn't mean you're not in charge. It just means somebody's got your back. I looked at my daughter's earnest face, and I thought about the rooster on the windowsill, and the words, "Nobody knows the whole number but me." And I had to work very hard to keep my own face soft and confused. The face of a tired old man being talked at. "I don't know," I said slowly. "Seems like a lot of paper for hands that just get cold sometimes." Nadine reached over and covered my hand with hers, gentle, as she'd been gentle all these weeks. "It's for your protection, Earl. Nobody's taking anything from you. We just love you, and we worry." I let a silence sit there. I've learned silence is a tool, same as a knife or a thermometer. People rush to fill it, and what they fill it with tells you everything. Vernon filled it. "Truth is, Earl, I've had my own doctor look at some of what you've described. The tremors, the mornings you can't find the right word for the feed order. He says at your age, with your family history, it's worth getting ahead of things. Nothing wrong with being cautious." That last part froze something in my chest. My family history. My father had gone soft in the mind the last 2 years of his life. God rest him, forgetting names, wandering the pasture at dusk, looking for cows that weren't there anymore. It was the one true weak place in me, the one fear I actually carried, and Vernon had found it, and was pressing on it like a thumb into a bruise. I want you to understand how skilled a manipulator he was. He didn't lie about the tremors. He didn't lie about my father. He took 2 true things and stitched them together into a story that wasn't true at all, and he did it so gently that even I, sitting there with 3 months of evidence hidden in my cellar, felt a cold finger of real doubt. What if I am starting to slip? What if this is exactly how it looked to my father's family before anyone would say it out loud? That's the danger of a good liar. He doesn't just fool the people around you. For one dizzy second at that table, he almost made me doubt myself. But I thought of the rooster. Nobody knows the whole number but me, and the doubt passed like weather. What would it mean, I asked, if I signed something like that practically? Vernon leaned forward, warming to the question the way he always warmed when he thought he was closing something. Practically nothing changes day to day. You still run the farm. It just means if anything happens, or honestly, Earl, even just to lighten your load now, someone with a clear head and steady hands can step in on the financial side. Signing checks, handling the bank, making sure a mistake in a column doesn't cost you the whole operation. There it was. Signing checks, handling the bank. He wanted legal cover for something he'd already been doing quietly for a year and a half. He wanted it in writing, notarized, unbreakable, so that whatever came next, whatever transfer or loan or sale, would look clean on paper, no matter how dirty it was underneath. I looked around that table. My wife's soft, encouraging face. My daughter's hopeful one. My stepfather's patient, fatherly smile. 3 people I loved or had loved, all leaning toward me, all wanting the same thing, all so sure they were doing right by the old fool. Let me think on it, I said. It's a big thing to sign your name to. Of course, Vernon said smoothly. No rush at all. Whenever you're ready. But I watched his eyes when he said it, and I saw the flicker of a man who'd expected an easier yes, calculating how much longer he could afford to wait. After dinner, once Vernon and Bryn had gone, Nadine found me out on the porch, where I'd gone to watch the light fail over the pasture. She sat beside me, closer than she'd sat in months, and for one strange moment in the blue dusk, with the smell of cut hay drifting up from the barn, I almost forgot what I knew. "You've been so patient with all of this, Earl," she said quietly. "I know it's a lot. The papers, Vernon hovering, Bryn pushing. I just want you comfortable. That's all I've ever wanted." I turned and looked at her, this woman I'd married, believing we'd grow old on this porch together. And for one heartbeat, I let myself wonder if there was any true thing left in what she'd just said, any thread of it that wasn't strategy. Then I remembered the cedar cologne on her jacket, and the crock in my cellar getting heavier every week. And I understood there was no way to know. And that not knowing was exactly the trap she and Vernon had built for me to live inside until I finally signed. "I know you do," I said, and I meant it as gently as I could. Because whatever she'd become, some tired part of me still didn't want to hate her. "Give me a little more time." She squeezed my hand and went inside. I sat alone on that porch a long while after listening to the creek run down through the north pasture. The same water that ran past the spot where Vernon had stood with his rolled-up plans, and I thought, they've made their opening move. Now it was time for Caleb and me to make ours. The opening move Caleb and I made wasn't loud. It was a phone call to a cousin of his in Salem who did title searches for a living, and it cost us a favor and a case of beer, and it gave us the first clean look at what Vernon's forgery was going to need to work. But before I tell you what we found, I have to tell you about the afternoon Bryn came apart in front of me. Because it changed how I understood the whole shape of what Vernon had built. It was a Thursday, about 10 days after the dinner, with the power of attorney papers. Bryn stopped by alone, which she hadn't done in weeks, always arriving now with Nadine, like she needed backup to talk to her own father. She found me in the barn, oiling a hinge on the milking parlor gate, and she leaned against the rail and watched me work for a while before she said anything. "Daddy, can I ask you something and you won't get mad?" "Try me," I said, not looking up from the hinge. "If the farm did sell, hypothetically, would there be enough for everybody to actually start over? Like, really start over?" My hands went still on the wrench. I made myself keep breathing easy. "Depends what everybody means by starting over," I said. She picked at a splinter on the rail, not meeting my eyes, and the words came out of her in a rush, the way confessions do when a person's been carrying them too long alone. "Vernon said once the land sells to the developers, there's more than enough to go around. He said Mom's owed something for putting up with all this. And he said I shouldn't have to keep living in that apartment over the feed store, working weekends at the diner. He said there'd be enough that I could get a real place. In Portland, maybe. He even showed me a listing once, this condo downtown with a view of the river. He said it like it was already decided, like it was already mine." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her face I hadn't let myself see before, under all the anger and the certainty she'd been performing at me for weeks. Fear. She was 24 years old, exhausted from 2 jobs, embarrassed of an apartment over a feed store, and a smooth old man had shown her a picture of a life she wanted and told her all she had to do was help ease her stubborn old father out of the way. "When did he show you that listing?" I asked, as gently as I could manage, with my heart going like a hammer. "A few months ago. Right around when he started saying you needed help with the books." She said it and then heard it the way it lined up, and her face went pale. "Daddy, why does that matter?" I could have told her everything right there in the barn. God, I wanted to. But I still didn't have the paper. I still didn't have proof strong enough to survive a lawyer, and if I lit the fuse now on nothing but a condo listing and a feeling Vernon would simply deny it, Nadine would rally to him, and my own daughter, humiliated and confused, might run straight back into their arms out of sheer embarrassment at having doubted them. So instead I did something that still shames me a little, even knowing why I did it. I lied to my daughter's face gently, the way you'd handle a frightened animal. "It doesn't matter, sweetheart," I said. "I just wondered if Vernon had already been making promises before anything's even decided. That's a little premature of him, don't you think?" She latched on to that, relieved to have an explanation that wasn't the one clawing at the back of her mind. "That's what I thought too. I mean, I'm sure he just meant well." "I'm sure," I said. She hugged me before she left. The first real hug in weeks. And I stood in the barn doorway and watched her drive off. And I understood something new about the man I was up against. Vernon hadn't just charmed my wife and gaslit my daughter about my mind. He'd bought Bryn outright. Cheap, with nothing but a picture of an apartment she'd never actually get, because a man who was already planning to disappear with the money had no intention of buying anyone a condo. He was spending promises he'd never have to keep, the cheapest currency in the world. That night I told Caleb everything Bryn had said. And I watched something harden in my son's face that I recognized, because it was the same thing that had hardened in mine 3 months earlier. He's not just after Nadine's trust, Caleb said. He's bought the whole family with things he's never going to deliver, Bryn's condo. Whatever he's telling Nadine about their future together. He's just handing out chips he doesn't have. That's why we let him keep dealing them, I said. Every chip he hands out is a promise he has to keep track of. And a man juggling that many lies eventually drops one where we can see it. Caleb was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. You feel bad for her, Bryn, I mean? Every day, I said. She's not wicked, son. She's tired, and she's 24, and a smooth old man showed her a picture of a life easier than the one she's got. That's not a crime. It's just how people get led places they shouldn't go. I feel worse for her than I do for Nadine, if I'm honest. Nadine's a grown woman who knew exactly what she was doing when she started meeting Vernon at that motel. Bryn just wanted her father to stop struggling and her own life to stop being so hard. So what do we do about her? We wait, I said. When this comes down, and it will come down, I want her standing close enough to see the truth with her own eyes, not hear it secondhand from a father she's already decided is losing his grip. Seeing does something, hearing never can. It was around then that Vernon started pushing harder for my answer on the power of attorney, and I understood I couldn't stall forever without raising suspicion. So I did what I'd been planning since that night on the porch. I gave him hope. I called a family meeting myself, which surprised all three of them, and I sat at the head of my own table and told them I'd thought it over and that I was leaning toward signing, but that an old man deserved to feel like it was his idea and not his family's. I asked for 2 more weeks. I said I wanted Odell Simmons, the lawyer who'd handled my father's estate and mine for 30 years, to look it over first, just so I could feel right about it in my own head. I watched Vernon's face when I said Odell's name, and for just a flicker, less than a second, something moved behind his easy smile. Calculation. He knew Odell. Everybody in this county who'd farmed longer than a decade knew Odell Simmons, and knew he wasn't a man who signed off on anything without reading every line twice. Of course, Earl, Vernon said smoothly, recovering fast. Take your 2 weeks. A man should feel good about a decision like this. But I'd seen the flicker. And I understood that somewhere behind that warm, patient face Vernon Pike had just started for the first time since this whole thing began, to worry. Odell Simmons had an office above the hardware store in town. 2 rooms with a window unit that rattled, and he'd been my family's lawyer since before I was born, the way his father had been my father's. He was 71, built like a fence post, and he didn't waste words. I went to see him alone on a Tuesday, telling Nadine I was hauling a hay baler in for repair. I sat across the desk from him and laid out 3 months of my life. The cologne, the motel, the pasture meeting with the developer, the Roosters recording, the power of attorney papers waiting in a drawer at home for my signature. Odell listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet a long moment. Earl, he said finally, you understand what you're describing is bigger than a bad marriage. If that development company's already drawing plans on your pasture, somebody's got money committed to this. Real money doesn't wait around for an old man to feel comfortable. There's a schedule running somewhere I can't see yet. That's what scares me, I said. Bring me the power of attorney draft, he said. And anything else with your name already on it that you didn't put there yourself. Bank documents, loan paperwork, anything. I want to compare every signature against your real hand. That was the assignment that led to the worst afternoon of the whole ordeal, and the one that turned everything from a family betrayal into something the law had a name for. Caleb and I spent 2 days quietly gathering every document we could find with my name on it. Some I had originals for, tucked safe in the crock behind the cheddar. Others existed only in the farm's official file, which Vernon kept now on his laptop, encrypted a password I didn't have. But farms leave paper trails in more places than one man's laptop. Caleb, sharp as he has remembered that the county recorder's office keeps copies of anything filed against real property, and a week earlier, he'd noticed something odd pulling an unrelated survey map. A document had been recorded against our land 8 months back, a modification to the equipment loan at the Farm Credit Union, expanding it by $140,000 secured against 40 acres of the North pasture. I had never seen that loan. I had never asked for it. I had certainly never signed for it. We drove into town together and pulled the recorded copy, and Caleb laid it flat on Odell's desk, and the three of us leaned over it under the window unit's rattle. There was my signature, Earl Hollister. The same slow, careful loop I'd learned on my father's knee. The same slant even, the same little hitch where the arthritis makes my pen catch on the second L. I stared at it a long time. Then I picked up a pen from Odell's desk, and I signed my own name on a scrap paper beside it, naturally unthinking the way I'd sign anything. They matched close enough to fool a bank teller in a hurry. They matched close enough to fool a notary who wanted to be fooled. But they didn't match perfectly, not to a man who's watched his own hand shake for 6 years and knows exactly where it catches and where it doesn't. "That hitch," I said, my voice not quite steady. "Right there, on the second L. Mine catches because my hand cramps at that letter every single time. His doesn't catch there. It catches one letter early on the R." Odell pulled a magnifying glass from his drawer and studied both signatures a long, silent minute. "You're right," he said quietly. "Somebody who's watched you sign 1,000 times learned your shape but not your habit. That's what happens when a man builds a signature off memory instead of off the muscle that actually makes it." And I understood sitting there exactly how Vernon had gotten close enough to steal my hand. A year and a half of sitting beside me at that kitchen table, watching me sign check after check while he helped with the books, studying the shape of my name until he could reproduce it well enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking as hard as I was. I'd handed him the books because my hands hurt and my eyes were tired. I'd handed him, without knowing it, the one thing a forger needs most: practice. Odell leaned back and looked at both of us a long moment. "Earl, I want to say this plainly. What you're showing me isn't a family dispute anymore. Forging your signature on a loan document and recording it against your property is fraud, a crime, not just a wrong. We're talking about you and this farm being victims of a felony." The word felony sat heavy in that little office. Caleb's jaw was tight. "There's more," I said. "I know there's more. The power of attorney is sitting in a drawer at my house right now, waiting for my real signature because they need at least one document with a genuine Earl Hollister on it to make everything else look legitimate around it. A forged loan next to a real, willingly signed power of attorney looks a lot more innocent than a forged loan sitting alone." Odell nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'd expect from somebody smart enough to have studied your hand for a year. He needs your true signature on record recently, so a jury or a bank examiner sees a pattern of you being an active, willing participant in your own affairs. It insulates every forgery around it." "So what do I do?" Odell was quiet a moment, and then something shifted in his face. The careful look of a lawyer starting to build a plan instead of just assess a wound. "You sign it," he said. I stared at him. "Odell, I just told you. I heard you. You sign it, Earl, but you don't sign the copy they hand you. I draft a version word for word, identical on its face, but with one clause buried in it that changes everything. A clause requiring my signature as witnessing counsel before it takes any effect. They won't read past the first page. Men like this never do. They'll see your name at the bottom and think they've won." Caleb leaned forward. "And when they try to use it, it won't hold up," Odell said. "And worse for them, my name will be on it as the attorney who witnessed it, which means the moment they act on a document I control, I'm standing right there with everything Earl's already gathered. Forged loan, forged signature, recorded fraud against real property, and now an attempted second fraud right in front of a licensed attorney, at the exact moment they think they've finally got their hands on the whole farm." I sat back in that hard wooden chair and felt something settle in my chest for the first time in 3 months. Not relief, not yet, but direction. We finally had a shape for the trap, not just a pile of evidence waiting for a use. "There's one more thing you should know," Odell said, folding his hands again. "A man clever enough to forge a signature this well doesn't usually work alone on the endgame. He'll want a clean date, a public moment, something with witnesses, so that if you ever try to claim later you were pressured, there's a room full of family who'll swear you signed of your own free will. A ceremony, I said slowly. A ceremony, Odell agreed. He'll want it soon now that he knows you've brought a lawyer in, and Earl, when he sets that date, you let him. You let the way he wants it. Because the bigger the audience he builds to watch you sign, the bigger the audience that's going to watch what happens after. Odell drafted the substitute power of attorney over the following week, and I want to tell you it was simple, but nothing about tricking a trickster is simple. The document had to look on its face exactly like what Vernon expected. Same letterhead style, same boilerplate language he'd have seen in 100 templates online, same blank lines in the same places. Odell studied a copy of the original draft Nadine had left in our kitchen drawer, matched its formatting almost line for line, and then buried his one clause deep in paragraph 9, in dense legal language that would put a sharp eye to sleep. Effective only upon independent review and countersignature by licensed counsel of the grantor's choosing. 9 times out of 10, Odell told me, a man in a hurry to close a deal skims the signature page and skips the middle. Vernon's spent 1.5 years being patient with you, Earl. Patient men get sloppy right at the finish line because by then they believe they've already won. I carried that substitute document home myself, folded inside a farm supply catalog so it wouldn't draw a second look, and I slid it into the same kitchen drawer where the original had been sitting. And I quietly moved the original into an envelope Caleb photographed and carried down to the crock that same night. If anyone compared the two side by side, they'd have caught it in a heartbeat. But nobody was going to compare them. Nobody was looking for a trick from the man they'd already decided couldn't hold a coffee cup steady. 2 days later, I told Nadine I'd made my decision. I was ready to sign. I have never in my life watched a woman's face do what hers did in that moment. Relief, first so total it seemed to loosen something in her shoulders that had been tight for months. Then something under the relief I couldn't quite name until I understood watching her that it was guilt trying to surface and being pushed back down before it could reach her mouth. "Oh, Earl," she said, and she hugged me. And for one strange second, the hug felt almost real, the way an old habit can feel real even after the thing behind it has died. "You won't regret this. I promise you won't regret this." I said nothing. I let her have her relief. It cost me nothing, and it bought me everything because a relieved woman doesn't look too closely at anything. Vernon, when Nadine called to tell him, wanted to move fast, faster than I expected. Within a day, he was talking about a date, a proper occasion, not just papers signed quietly at the kitchen table, but something with the whole family present. He framed it, of course, as a kindness to me. A man shouldn't sign away 60 years of worry alone at his own kitchen table like he's ashamed of it. He told me over the phone, warm as ever. "You should have your family around you, Earl. Bryn there. Trey's boy could drive up from Eugene. We'll make a nice dinner of it, mark the occasion properly." I understood exactly what he was building because Odell had told me to expect it. A room full of witnesses who'd swear, if it ever came to that Earl Hollister signed of his own free will. Surrounded by people who loved him, nobody holding a gun to his head. Vernon wasn't planning a family dinner. He was building himself an alibi out of pot roast and good china. "Whatever makes it easier," I told him. "You pick the date." He picked it fast. 9 days out of Saturday, and he insisted on bringing in a notary himself, a man named Feld. He said he'd used before for business matters, rather than trusting the county recorder's office notary I'd have picked. I mentioned that detail to Odell that same evening, standing in his little office with the window unit off for once, the room finally quiet. Odell's face went still in a way I hadn't seen before. "Feld," he said. "Gerald Feld. That's what Vernon called him." Odell was quiet a long moment. And then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. And inside it was a newspaper clipping 3 years old about a notary in the next county over who'd lost his commission for backdating documents on a disputed estate. The name on the clipping was Gerald Feld. "He got his license back 2 years ago," Odell said. Quietly. Most people in this county never even knew he lost it in the first place, but I remember every man who's ever bent the law in front of a county judge, Earl. It's the one thing I never forget. I sat there in that hard wooden chair and felt the whole shape of it come together. Vernon hadn't found some random notary out of a phone book. He'd found the one man in 3 counties who'd already shown a willingness to sign what he was told to sign. This wasn't just fraud building on fraud. It was a man who'd built his own private machinery piece by piece over years for exactly the moment that was now 9 days away. "Can we stop it?" Caleb asked. "Report failed before Saturday." Odell shook his head slowly. "Not without tipping our own hand, and not without proof he's done anything wrong yet. Suspicion of an old case isn't evidence of a new one. No, we let Saturday happen. We let Feld sit down at that table with his stamp and his ink pad thinking he's got a compliant old man and a family full of witnesses ready to vouch for how willing everybody was." "And then?" I asked. Odell almost smiled, which, for a man like Odell Simmons, was as close to a battle cry as I'd ever heard. "And then, Earl, I walk in the door behind him." I drove home that night past the turnoff to the Sandpiper Motel, past the graveled track that led up to my own north pasture, where Vernon had once stood, pointing at a subdivision that didn't exist yet. And I thought about 9 days and a crock full of evidence aging quiet in the dark of my cellar, and a compromised notary who thought he'd found one more easy old man. 9 more days, I thought. Let it ripen. Let it all ripen right up until the moment they think they're pulling it down off the shelf. Saturday came in gray and still, the kind of Tillamook morning where the fog sits low over the pasture until almost 10, and I stood at my bedroom window watching it burn off slow over the north field, thinking that somewhere under that fog was the exact ground Vernon meant to sell out from under me. I dressed careful that morning. Not my church clothes, nothing that would look like I'd made an occasion of it, just a clean flannel shirt and my good jeans. The clothes of a man who wasn't nervous about anything. I looked at my hands in the bathroom mirror a long while. They shook the same as always. I decided that was fine. Let them shake. Let every last person at that table see exactly the tired old man they expected. Caleb arrived early before anyone else, under the excuse of helping me move hay bales out of the good parlor, so there'd be room for extra chairs. Really, he was there to run one last check on the recorder tucked in his jacket pocket, and to give me a look on his way out to the truck that said everything neither of us was willing to say out loud in a house that might be listening. "Odell's timing it," Caleb said quietly, loading the last bale. "He'll be parked down the road, not inside of the house. The second Feld signature hits that page, I call him, and he's up the drive in under 4 minutes. And if something goes wrong," I said, "if they change the plan on us," Caleb looked at me steady, "then we still walk out of here with everything in that crock, Dad. Nothing about today can undo 3 months of proof. Worst case, we just don't get the ending today. We get it eventually." I nodded. It was the kind of thing his grandfather, my own father, might have said back before his mind went, and it settled something in me to hear it in Caleb's voice instead. By 11, they started arriving. Bryn first, in a good dress, carrying a store-bought pie like this really was some kind of family celebration, and she hugged me tight in the doorway and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Daddy, for finally letting us help." And I had to look over her shoulder at the fog still hanging on the far tree line so she wouldn't see my face. Then Trey and his wife drove up from Eugene. Trey, a heavier, louder echo of Vernon's charm, without half his patience, shaking my hand too hard and clapping me on the shoulder like we'd already closed some grand deal between men. His wife brought a bottle of wine nobody would end up drinking. Nadine had been up since dawn cooking, and the kitchen smelled of roast and rosemary the way it used to smell on our good Sundays, back before any of this. And there was something in that smell that nearly broke me more than anything else that whole ordeal. It smelled like the marriage I'd actually wanted. Vernon arrived last, deliberately, I think, the way an important man always arrives last to his own party. He came in a good sport coat, freshly barbered, carrying a leather folio under his arm, like a man of business, And behind him, a step back and a little unsure of his welcome, came a thin man in a wrinkled gray suit with a battered notary stamp case in his hand. Gerald Feld looked exactly like a man who'd once lost his license and gotten it back quiet. He had the eyes of somebody used to not being looked at too closely, and he wouldn't quite meet mine when Vernon introduced us. "Earl, this is Gerald. He's going to make everything official and proper for us today," Vernon said, warm as ever, guiding Feld toward the kitchen table like a host, seating an honored guest. "Pleasure," Feld mumbled, setting his case down, and already fumbling it open, eager I noticed to get through whatever he'd come to do. We sat down to eat first, because Vernon insisted. Because a man building himself an alibi wants a full table of witnesses who'll remember a nice dinner, easy conversation, laughter, nothing that looked like pressure. I sat at the head of my own table and passed the rolls, and asked Trey's wife about her garden, and complimented Nadine on the roast, and the whole time I felt the weight of that folded document sitting in the kitchen drawer 8 feet from my elbow, waiting. Bryn was radiant that afternoon, talking about apartments in Portland like she'd already signed a lease, and twice I caught Vernon shooting her a look, a small warning flash I don't think anyone else at that table noticed. A look that said, "Not yet, not in front of him." She caught herself both times and steered the conversation elsewhere, and watching her do it, I understood she'd learned to manage her own hope carefully around Vernon. The way you learn to manage anything you're not sure will actually be given to you. When the plates were cleared, Vernon stood at the head of the table where I usually sat, and I let him have that spot without a word, because a man who thinks he's already won likes to be given the head of the table. "Family," he said, spreading his hands the way he always did. "We're here today because Earl's had the courage to do something hard, to trust the people who love him, to let go of a little bit of worry so the rest of us can help carry the load." He looked at me and his eyes were warm, and I want you to understand that even then, even knowing everything I knew, some old, worn-down part of me almost believed he meant it. "Gerald," Vernon said, "why don't we get everybody comfortable and get this handled?" Feld cleared his throat, pulled the folded document from the drawer where I'd placed it 2 days before, smoothed it flat on the table in front of me, and uncapped his pen. "Mr. Hollister," he said, not quite looking at me, "if you'll just review and sign where indicated." I picked up the papers Odell had built, page by careful page, and I made a show of reading the first the way a careful old man would, my lips moving slightly the way they do when my eyes get tired. Around that table I could feel every person leaning in, just slightly, just enough. Nadine's hand tight around her wine glass, Bryn's eyes bright with a future she believed was finally arriving. Trey, grinning like a man watching a horse he'd bet on cross the line. And Vernon standing behind my chair now, one hand resting light on my shoulder. Exactly where it had rested on Nadine's the day I first saw him at that motel. Watching the pen in my hand, like a man watching the last card turn over in his favor. I turned the first page slow, the way an old man does, and Feld's pen tapped once against the table. A small, impatient sound. He probably didn't even know he made. "Take your time, Earl," Vernon said from behind my shoulder. But there was something under the warmth now. A thread pulled just slightly tighter than it needed to be. I turned the second page. My eyes moved over Odell's careful boilerplate, and I let my lips move a little more, and somewhere in the room, a chair creaked as somebody shifted their weight, and I understood the whole table was holding its breath around an old man's slow reading, the way a congregation holds its breath before a verdict. "Everything look all right?" Nadine asked, too bright, too fast. "Looks fine," I said, not looking up. "Lot of words for a simple thing." Trey laughed too loud at that, the laugh of a man trying to loosen a room that didn't want to loosen. "That's lawyers for you, Earl. Never say in 1 page what they can say in 10. I let my eyes drift back to the page, and I thought about all the Sundays I'd spent turning cheese wheels in the cellar, while this document or one shaped just like it waited to be born in some office in Portland. I thought about Vernon at my kitchen table with a pen in his hand, a year and a half ago, saying, "Let me take this weight off you, Earl," while he learned the shape of my name letter by letter. I thought about the rooster on the windowsill, and nobody knows the whole number but me. Feld shifted in his chair, the small, restless motion of a man used to moving fast through documents that don't get read too closely. "Whenever you're comfortable, Mr. Hollister. No rush, of course." But there was rush in his voice. There was rush in all of them dressed up as patients, the particular kind of stillness a room gets when everyone in it wants the exact same thing and is trying hard not to show how badly. I turned the third page. And I want to tell you something honest about that moment sitting at my own table, with 3 months of quiet work sitting 8 feet away, in a kitchen drawer that Feld had already emptied with my whole family's eyes on my hand. For one heartbeat I doubted. Not the plan. The plan was sound. Odell was sound. The clause was buried exactly where it needed to be. What I doubted, sitting there with the pen finally in my hand, was whether I had the nerve to actually go through with playing it out. Whether I could sit in that chair and let this go all the way to the wire without my own face betraying me, without some tremor that wasn't arthritis giving away that the tired old fool at the head of the table understood exactly what was happening in that room. Vernon's hand pressed just slightly on my shoulder. "Whenever you're ready, Earl." And I thought of my father, wandering that pasture at dusk in his last years, looking for cows that weren't there. And I thought that whatever else this cost me, I was not going to let this family believe that story about me. I was not going to let Vernon Pike's lie about my mind become the last true thing anyone remembered. I signed the first line. Nadine let out a small breath. Bryn's hand found Trey's wife's hand under the table. A little squeeze of excitement neither of them hid well. Vernon's fingers on my shoulder relaxed, just slightly, the grip of a man who believes the hard part is already behind him. Feld reached over and turned to the second signature line, tapping it with one finger. "And here, Mr. Hollister." I signed the second line. There was one more. The final page, the one where Odell's clause sat buried in paragraph 9. Just above it, the clause that would strip every bit of power out of everything I'd just signed, unless he himself walked through that door with his own counter-signature. I picked up the pen for the third and final time, and Feld slid the last page toward me. I let my hand hover there a moment. The tip of the pen an inch above the paper, and I watched the room without seeming to watch it. Nadine's knuckles white around the stem of her wineglass. Bryn leaning forward, breathless, already halfway to the apartment in Portland she believed was finally coming true. Trey grinning at his wife, like the two of them had already spent money that wasn't theirs to spend. And Vernon above me, so close I could smell that same cedar cologne that had started this whole thing. His patience finally visibly thinning. For one terrible second, the whole room seemed to lean in at once, and I heard very faintly through the kitchen window I'd left cracked an inch for exactly this reason, the low sound of a car engine coming up the gravel drive. Vernon heard it too. I felt his hand go still on my shoulder. "Expecting someone, Earl?" he asked. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I heard something underneath the warmth in his voice that wasn't warmth at all. "Don't believe so," I said, keeping my eyes on the page, keeping the pen moving toward the line. Nadine's face had gone pale, her eyes flicking toward the window. Bryn looked between her mother and her stepfather, confused by the sudden change in the room's temperature. Trey stood halfway up from his chair, the instinct of a man who senses trouble before he understands it. The engine outside cut off. A car door opened and closed, unhurried, deliberate. Vernon's hand tightened on my shoulder again. Harder this time, no longer resting easy. "Earl," he said, and his voice had dropped, the warmth entirely now gone flat and careful. "Finish signing." I looked up at him then, for the first time since he'd taken that spot behind my chair, and I let him see just for a second exactly what was actually behind my own tired old eyes. "I intend to," I said, and I set the pen down on the table, unsigned. The third line still blank just as footsteps hit the porch and a knuckle rapped twice against my front door. Nobody at that table moved. Not Nadine, frozen with her glass halfway to her lips. Not Bryn, her mouth still open on some word she never finished. Not Trey, half risen from his chair like a man who'd forgotten what standing was for. Only Vernon's eyes moved, flicking from the door to my face to the unsigned line on the table doing arithmetic I could watch happening behind them, fast and cold. The calculations of a man who has just felt the ground shift under a deal he thought was already closed. The knock came again. 2 knuckles, unhurried, patient, as a man who has all the time in the world, because he knows exactly what's waiting on the other side of the door he's about to walk through. Caleb opened the door, because I'd asked him to, standing quiet by the hallway all through dinner, like a man with nothing better to do than lean on a wall. Odell Simmons walked into my kitchen carrying a leather satchel, of his own, older and more worn than Vernon's leather folio. And behind him came a second man I hadn't expected. A sheriff's deputy in plain clothes that Odell had quietly arranged a friend from 30 years of small-town favors. They're not to arrest anyone yet, just to witness, and to make sure nothing that happened in that room in the next few minutes could later be denied by anyone at that table. "Afternoon, folks," Odell said, mild as Sunday weather, setting his satchel on the counter like a man who'd been invited to dinner all along. "Sorry to interrupt. Earl asked me to stop by and review this document before anything got finalized. Attorney's habit. Hope nobody minds." The color had drained clean out of Vernon's face, though he was working hard to keep his voice level. "Odell, this is a family matter. I don't think we need counsel involved in a private signing." "Normally I'd agree with you," Odell said, pulling a folded copy of his own draft from the satchel and laying it on the table beside the one Feld had brought. Side by side, close enough that anyone with eyes could see they were built from the same template. "Except Earl's my client, and my client asked me to make sure whatever he signed today actually did what everybody told him it would do. That's not interference, Vernon. That's just the job." He nodded toward the deputy standing quiet by the door. "This is Ray. He's not here in any official capacity today, just an old friend doing me a favor by riding along, in case anybody later wants to argue about who said what in this room. Nobody's under arrest. Nobody's being accused of anything just yet. I'd just like everyone to keep that in mind while we talk." The word arrest landed in that kitchen like a dropped plate. Trey's wife made a small sound and set down her fork. Feld had gone very still in his chair, his pen frozen an inch above the table. And I watched him recognize Odell's name land somewhere behind his eyes, watched the particular fear of a man who has bent the rules before and knows exactly what it looks like when someone's finally come to check his work. "Gerald," Odell said, turning to him almost gently, "you notarized a loan modification 8 months back. Farm Credit Union, $140,000 against 40 acres of Earl's North pasture. You want to tell this table whose signature you certified on that document?" Feld's mouth opened, and nothing came out. "Because I've got the recorded copy right here," Odell said. "And I've got Earl's actual signature, the one he's made 10,000 times in front of witnesses, who've known him his whole life. And they don't match. Not close enough to survive an afternoon in front of a judge who knows what he's looking at." The table had gone dead silent. Bryn's face had drained of every bit of the light it carried an hour before. Trey looked at his wife, then at Vernon, then at the door, the instinct of a man calculating exits. Nadine sat frozen, her wine glass still in her hand, staring at Odell like a woman watching a wall she'd trusted come apart brick by brick. "This is absurd," Vernon said, and now the warmth was entirely gone from his voice, stripped down to something harder underneath, something I hadn't heard from him in 40 years. "Earl's confused. His memory's not what it was. Everyone at this table has watched him struggle these past months." "Have they?" I said. Every head at that table turned to me. I stood up slowly from my chair, and for the first time in 3 months I let my voice carry the way it used to carry across the milking parlor, before my hearing started to go strong and level and entirely without a tremor. "I'm not confused, Vernon," I said. "I've never once been confused, not about my hands, and not about you and Nadine down at the Sandpiper Motel every Tuesday for the better part of 2 years, and not about the man in the black SUV you met up in my north pasture with a set of plans for a subdivision that doesn't exist yet, because it's never going to exist, not on Hollister land." Bryn made a small, broken sound beside me, a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Nadine's glass slipped from her fingers and hit the table, wine spreading dark across the white cloth like something bleeding. "Earl," she started. "Not yet," I said, not unkindly, but final. "You'll get your turn." I walked to the kitchen drawer. The same drawer where a substitute document had waited 2 days, where the real forged loan had been photographed and carried down to my cellar. And I opened it and pulled out the fireproof bag Caleb had brought up that morning while Vernon and Feld were still in the driveway, shaking hands over pot roast neither of us would eat. I set it on the table in the middle of all of them, between the flowers and the untouched bottle of wine. And I opened it, and I began to lay it out. Bank statements showing the loan Vernon had opened in my name without my knowledge. The recorded document with my forged signature beside a fresh sample of my real one, the mismatch plain even to eyes that didn't want to see it. A photograph of Vernon's silver truck, parked behind the sandpiper. Time stamped alongside 7 more, just like it, stretching back 3 months. A printed transcript of the Roosters recording Vernon's own words in black and white. Nobody knows the whole number but me. Vernon stared at the papers spreading across my table like a man watching his own blood on the floor, and I watched something happen behind his eyes that I want you to understand, because it's the thing I remember most clearly out of that whole afternoon. He wasn't looking at me with hatred. He was looking at all of us, at Nadine and Bryn and Trey doing arithmetic again, fast and cold, the same arithmetic I'd watched him do at the door minutes before. He was already calculating how much of this he could still walk away from, and who he was willing to leave behind on the table to buy himself the room to do it. Odell watched him do it too. I saw the old lawyer's eyes narrow just slightly, the look of a man who's spent 40 years reading exactly this kind of calculation on exactly this kind of face across a courtroom, and who already knows before the man himself has even finished thinking it through precisely which way he's about to jump. "Vernon," Odell said quietly into the silence that had swallowed the whole kitchen. "Before you say another word, I'd think very carefully about who you're planning to leave holding this." Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment after Odell's words landed. And in that silence, I watched the last of Vernon Pike's warmth burn off him like fog off the pasture, leaving something underneath that I don't think even Nadine had ever fully seen. "I don't know what any of this proves," Vernon said finally, and his voice had gone thin and careful, a lawyer's voice, though he'd never been one. "Signatures can look similar. Coincidences happen. And frankly, Earl standing up here waving papers around, after everything this family's done to help you, feels like exactly the kind of confused episode I was worried about." "Save it," Odell said, not unkindly, the way a man speaks to someone he's already stopped needing to convince. "I've spent 40 years listening to men explain away their own handwriting. It doesn't get more persuasive with repetition." He turned to Feld, who still hadn't moved his pen, still hovering uselessly over a page nobody was going to finish signing. "Gerald, I'm going to give you a piece of free advice, and you can take it or not. The state board doesn't look kindly on a second offense. If you cooperate now, tell the truth about who asked you to backdate or notarize documents you didn't actually witness signed, that goes a long way. If you sit here and help Vernon keep lying, it doesn't." Feld's hands were shaking now, worse than mine ever had. He looked at Vernon, then at the deputy by the door, then down at his own stamp case, like it had turned into something venomous in his hands. "He paid me $800, Feld said quietly, the words falling out of him in a rush, like a man who's been carrying something heavy a long time and finally sets it down. "Back in the spring. Told me it was just a formality that Earl had already agreed verbally and just hadn't gotten around to the paperwork. I never saw Earl sign anything. I stamped what Vernon put in front of me." "You son of a..." Vernon started, and for the first time that afternoon, his composure cracked all the way open, ugly and fast, and I saw underneath the silver fox charm he'd worn for 40 years, like a good coat, the actual shape of the man who'd been wearing it. "That's enough," Odell said sharp now, the first hard edge I'd heard from him all day. "Everyone in this room just heard a licensed notary admit to falsifying an official document for money. Ray here heard it too, and while he's not writing anything down today in any official capacity, I promise you he remembers things very well. The deputy by the door nodded once quiet, saying nothing, which somehow said everything. Nadine had gone very still in her chair. Her face a color I'd never seen on her, somewhere between gray and green. "Vernon," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "Tell me you didn't. Tell me this isn't what it sounds like." Vernon didn't even look at her. That was the thing I noticed most in that whole terrible afternoon. The thing that told me everything I still needed to know about the true shape of what had happened in my house for the past 2 years. His wife, or the woman who'd become his in every way but law, was sitting 3 feet away, asking him to look at her, and he was staring past her at the door, already calculating his way out of the room. "I need to call my attorney," Vernon said, standing up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "This conversation over." "It can be over whenever you like," Odell said mildly. "The paperwork isn't going anywhere. I filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office this morning before I ever walked through that door, along with a fraud report with the district attorney's fraud unit, backed by 3 months of documented evidence Earl and Caleb have been gathering. That process doesn't stop because you leave a kitchen, Vernon. It's already running." I watched something collapse behind Vernon's eyes at that. The last flicker of a man who'd believed right up until that sentence that there was still some clean exit waiting for him if he could just get out the door fast enough. Bryn hadn't said a single word through any of it. She sat frozen beside her mother, staring at the spread of evidence across the table, at the photograph of Vernon's truck behind the Sandpiper Motel, at the transcript of his own voice saying, "Nobody knows the whole number but me," and I watched my daughter's whole understanding of the last 6 months come apart in real time, piece by piece, the way a cheese wheel collapses once you finally cut into a rind that was never as solid as it looked. "The condo," she said so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Vernon, you showed me a listing. You said once the land sold." "Bryn, honey, that's not—" Vernon started. And for the first time all afternoon I heard something in his voice that might have been real. Not guilt, just the sound of a man realizing he'd miscounted how many promises he could break before someone finally added them all up in front of him. "Was any of it true?" Bryn asked, and her voice was rising now, cracking at the edges. "Any of it? Or was I just another person you were managing?" Vernon didn't answer. And in the silence where an answer should have been, I watched my daughter get her first real look at the man she'd trusted over her own father, and I watched her finally understand all at once and much too late exactly what that trust had cost. Trey had gone quiet in a way I'd never seen from him. His loud confidence drained clean out of him. His eyes darting between his uncle and the door like a man trying to remember whether he'd touched anything that could be traced back to him. His wife had already pulled her purse into her lap. The instinct of someone who wanted to be gone before whatever was happening finished happening. "I think," Odell said into the wreckage of that kitchen, "the smartest thing anyone at this table can do right now is go home and think hard about what they knew and when they knew it. Because a fraud investigation doesn't stay small, folks. It has a way of asking everybody in the room the same question." Vernon didn't wait to hear anything else. He snatched his leather folio off the table, and without another word to Nadine, without a single glance back at Bryn, he walked out of my kitchen and across my porch and down the steps to his silver truck, and I watched through the window as he drove away fast, gravel spitting up behind his tires. A man running from a fire he'd spent 2 years quietly building himself. He didn't look back once. Not at the house. Not at Nadine standing frozen in the doorway watching him go. Not at anything he was leaving behind. I stood at that window a long while after the sound of his engine faded down the county road. And I understood, watching the dust settle over my own gravel drive, that whatever came next, Vernon Pike had just shown every single person in that kitchen exactly who he'd always been. Nadine didn't leave with the rest of them. Trey and his wife made their excuses fast, mumbling about the drive back to Eugene, and Bryn walked out to her car without a word to anyone. Her shoulders shaking in a way that told me she needed to be alone more than she needed comfort from a father she'd have to reckon with sooner or later. Odell gathered his papers and gave my hand a firm shake, and said he'd be in touch about next steps, and the deputy nodded his quiet goodbye. And then it was just Nadine and me standing in a kitchen still smelling of roast and rosemary wine soaking dark into the good tablecloth. She sat down heavy in her chair, the one she'd sat in every night of our marriage, and she put her face in her hands. And for a long while, she didn't say anything at all. "I need to call him," she finally said, not looking up. "He needs to explain this. There has to be an explanation." "Nadine?" I said, gentle as I could manage. "You heard the notary. You heard him say the words, 'Vernon paid him.' People panic," she said, and her voice had a brittle, desperate edge to it now. The sound of someone building a wall out of whatever material was left lying around. "He panicked, seeing Odell walk in like that. He'll explain everything once he calms down." I didn't argue with her. There wasn't any point. Some walls you can't talk a person out of building. They have to walk into them themselves and feel how solid they aren't. She called him 4 times that evening. I know because I sat in the next room, and I heard every ring go unanswered. Heard the particular silence of a phone that rings and rings into nothing. And then finally, on the 5th try, I heard her voice go from pleading to confused to something close to panic. "He's not answering," she said, coming to find me on the porch, where I'd gone to watch the last light fail over the pasture. The same porch where she'd once told me she just wanted me comfortable. "That's not like him. Even when we've fought before, he always answers eventually." "Try the joint account," I said. It wasn't kindness that made me say it. I'd known, sitting in Odell's office 2 weeks earlier, exactly what Vernon's next move would look like if his plan ever fell apart in front of witnesses. And I wanted her to see it with her own eyes before I had to say another word about it. She pulled up the banking app on her phone, her hands shaking now nearly as bad as mine ever had, and I watched her face change as the screen loaded. Whatever color the evening had left in her had already been draining slow since Vernon walked out that door. Now it went entirely. "That's wrong," she said. "That has to be wrong." She showed me the screen without meaning to, some instinct making her want to witness to a thing she couldn't believe alone. An account I hadn't known existed until that moment. One she and Vernon had apparently opened together back in the spring, the same season Feld had taken his $800. It had held, according to the transaction history scrolling past on her screen, just over $90,000 as of 2 days ago. The balance now read $4.12. "When was the last time you checked that account?" I asked. "I don't know. Weeks." He handled it. He said he was investing it, growing it for us, for when the land sold and we'd need somewhere clean to put the profit before. She stopped herself, hearing what she was about to admit out loud, and I watched her realize, right there on my porch in the fading light, exactly what she'd just confessed to. "Before what, Nadine?" I said quietly. She didn't answer at first. She sat very still, staring at the $4.12, glowing on her screen like it might change if she looked at it long enough. And I thought about all the months I'd spent watching her be gentle with me, touching my shoulder, asking after my hands. And I wondered how much of that gentleness had ever been real, and how much had simply been the discipline of a woman keeping a con running smooth until the day it no longer needed to be. "Before the sale went through clean," she finally said so quiet, I almost lost it to the evening breeze. "He said the developer would want everything to look simple on paper. No large deposits right before closing. He said he'd hold it safe until then." I already understood what that account had been for the same thing Odell had warned me. A schemer that patient would eventually need a clean place to move money before a sale. Some structure built to keep the real profit separate from whatever modest traceable cut she might have believed was coming to her. Except now there was nothing in it. $90,000, most of it likely drawn off that fraudulent loan against my north pasture. The very money that was supposed to be their future together, gone in what looked like a single transfer 2 days before that Saturday. Moved out to somewhere her banking app couldn't follow. 2 days before. Before the dinner. Before Feld ever unpacked his stamp case at my table. Vernon had emptied that account before he ever sat down to watch me sign anything, which meant he'd already been planning his exit before he knew Odell was coming through that door at all. He hadn't run because Odell caught him. He'd already been running quietly for at least 2 days, and the whole performance at my kitchen table had just been him collecting whatever he could on his way out. Nadine sat down hard on the porch step, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering against the wood. And she made a sound I'd never heard come out of her before. Something low and animal and completely without pretense. The sound of a woman finally understanding the true shape of the thing she'd traded her whole life to be part of. He was never going to share it, she said mostly to herself, the words coming out broken. He was never planning to stay, was he? I didn't answer that either. I didn't need to. She already knew, sitting there in the dark on the steps of a porch that belonged to a marriage she'd thrown away, exactly what the silence meant. I stood over her for a long moment. This woman I'd loved once, who'd helped build a scheme against me with a man who was already, even as she built it, planning to leave her holding every piece of the wreckage. Alone. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel standing there watching her come apart. Not triumph, not even satisfaction. Just a tired, aching sorrow for the two of us, for the marriage that had actually existed once a long time ago, before either one of us had let something rot quiet in the dark, long enough to bring us to this porch on this night, with a phone lying dead between us and $90,000 gone into the wind. It took 11 days for the whole shape of it to come clear, and I want to tell you about those 11 days honestly because they weren't triumphant. They were quiet and strange and full of a grief none of us had names for yet. Odell's fraud complaint moved fast once the county recorder's office and the district attorney's fraud unit got their hands on 3 months of documented evidence. A detective named Ruiz came out to the farm twice, a patient, thorough woman who sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and went through the crock's contents piece by piece with the same careful attention I'd given a cheese wheel my whole life. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The paper spoke for itself. What Ruiz found once she started pulling threads was worse and stranger than even Odell had guessed. Vernon Pike hadn't just forged one loan against my land. Over 18 months using the access I'd handed him at my own kitchen table, he'd quietly opened 3 separate lines of credit against the farm, each one smaller than the last, each one designed to stay under whatever threshold might trigger a closer look from a bank officer or a county clerk paying attention. $140,000 here, $60,000 there. A smaller equipment loan folded into an existing account so quietly, even the credit union's own system hadn't flagged it. All told, Ruiz's investigation turned up just over $280,000 borrowed against Hollister land that I had never seen a dime of and never authorized. That money hadn't gone toward a shared future with Nadine, whatever she'd been told. Ruiz traced it wire by wire through the account that had briefly held $90,000 before it emptied to $4.12, and from there out through 2 more accounts in neighboring states, each one a little harder to follow than the last. The careful architecture of a man who'd done this kind of thing before and knew exactly how to make money disappear into distance. Ruiz found something else, too, going back through old records. Vernon Pike wasn't his real last name, not originally. He'd changed it legally 30 years before he ever married my mother. Back in a different state, around the same time a similar pattern of forged signatures and disputed land transfers had quietly collapsed a family farm outside of Boise. No charges had stuck back then. The family had been too embarrassed, too grief-stricken, too eager to just make the whole thing go away quietly. The same instinct that nearly worked on us. He'd found my mother not long after that, a widow with a grown son and a modest house, and settled into 40 patient years of being exactly the kind of man a family learns to trust, without ever once earning it honestly. I sat with that for a long while after Ruiz told us. My mother had loved that man for 3 decades before she passed, believing every word he'd ever told her. I understood then that Vernon Pike wasn't a man who'd fallen for Nadine and gotten greedy along the way. Nadine hadn't been a fling that curdled into a scheme. She'd been the plan from the very beginning, the exact same plan he'd apparently run before, patient and practiced, a man who married old women and courted their families. And waited sometimes years, sometimes decades for the one soft place he could finally press his whole weight against. He had never loved her. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters more than anything else in this whole story. Vernon Pike had studied Nadine the way I studied a cheese I meant to sell, assessing exactly how long she'd need to age before she was ready to be used. And the moment she stopped being useful, the moment Odell walked through my door with a satchel full of proof, he set her down without a second thought and walked away clean, the way he'd apparently walked away from at least one other family before us. I told Caleb all of it sitting in his barn again, the same hay bale where this whole thing had started 3 months earlier. He was quiet a long time after I finished turning it over, the way we both turn things over. So he never wanted the marriage, Caleb finally said. He never wanted her at all. He just wanted a way in. That's what I keep coming back to, I said. All those months I thought I was watching a man steal my wife. I wasn't. I was watching a man rent her real careful for exactly as long as the job needed her, and then he handed back the keys and drove off without so much as a backward glance. Do you feel sorry for her? Caleb asked. I thought about that a long while before I answered, watching the evening settle gray and quiet over his own small piece of land. Some, I admitted. Not for what she did to me. She made those choices with clear eyes, whatever excuses she wants to build for herself now. But I feel sorry for a woman who gave up 30 years of a decent, honest marriage to chase a life some smooth-talking con man dangled in front of her and got nothing for it in the end but an empty account and a warrant with somebody else's name on it. He was never found. Detective Ruiz told us weeks later that the trail went cold somewhere past the Nevada state line cash withdrawals, and then nothing. The particular kind of nothing a man leaves behind when he's done this exact vanishing act enough times to know precisely how it's done. There's a warrant out for him still in 3 states now, but men like Vernon don't get caught by warrants. They get caught, if they ever do, by finally running out of new families willing to trust them. Nadine, though. Nadine they found everywhere, because Nadine hadn't gone anywhere at all. Her name was on the forged loan documents as a beneficiary. Her name was on the joint account that had briefly held $90,000 of stolen money before it vanished. Her signature, unlike mine, was real on every single piece of paper Vernon had needed her real signature on, because unlike me, she'd known exactly what she was signing. She had helped build the trap. She just hadn't understood until the very end that she'd built it for herself as much as for me. I thought about the rooster on the windowsill, still sitting there in my kitchen, still holding whatever ghost of that recording lingered in its hollow base. And I thought about all the nights Nadine had sat across from Vernon at that same table, believing herself his equal partner in something clever and profitable, never once imagining that she was simply the last in a long line of soft places a patient man had learned to press. Nadine was formally charged 6 weeks after that Saturday dinner. 2 counts, the district attorney's office told us. Fraud for her role, knowingly benefiting from the forged loan documents. And a lesser charge tied to the joint account for helping structure the transfers that had briefly carried stolen money through her own name before Vernon moved it beyond anyone's reach. In those 6 weeks, Bryn came back to me slow, the way a calf comes back to a gate it's been scared off of. One cautious step at a time. She didn't apologize all at once, and I didn't ask her to. She started small, driving out on a Sunday to help with chores she hadn't touched since she was a teenager, working alongside Caleb in a silence that gradually filled itself back in with ordinary talk. It was 3 weeks before she said Vernon's name out loud to me again. And when she finally did, sitting on the porch step with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, she said it like a wound she was finally willing to look at directly. I keep going back over every conversation, she told me, trying to find the moment I should have known. There isn't one moment, Daddy. There's just 100 small ones I talked myself out of noticing, because the version he was selling me was easier to believe than the truth sitting right in front of me. That's how it works on all of us, I said. It worked on me too, some, before I let myself really see it. A good liar doesn't hand you one big lie to swallow. He hands you 100 small, easy ones, and by the time you'd need to choke on all of them at once, you've already swallowed most of them without noticing. She leaned her head against my shoulder then, the way she used to when she was small enough to ride on it, through the milking parlor, and we sat like that a long while, saying nothing else. Because some kinds of forgiveness don't need more words than that. Nadine called me the night before her arraignment. I almost didn't answer. Caleb was sitting with me at the kitchen table, going over the fall milk contracts, and he watched my face when I saw her name on the screen, and he didn't say anything, just nodded once, the way he'd learned to do over these past months, telling me it was my choice and he'd stand behind whatever I decided. I stepped out onto the porch to take the call. "Earl," she said, and her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped down past the gentle southern warmth she used to wrap around every sentence, down to something plain and frightened. And for the first time in a long while, I believed honest. "I know I have no right to ask you anything, but I'm asking anyway." "Ask," I said. "My lawyer says a statement from you about my character, about our marriage before all this, could matter to the judge. Just something honest. You don't have to lie. You don't have to say I didn't do what I did, just something that shows I wasn't always this." I stood on that porch a long while, looking out at the pasture going dark. The same pasture Vernon had once stood in, with his rolled-up plans. And I thought about the question you asked yourself, listening to this story. The one I imagine some of you have been asking since I told you I decided not to lock a door that should have been locked. Since I told you I let a scheme run its course instead of ending it the day I found it. Do you lock the door the moment you find the wolf? Or do you let it walk further into the light, where everyone can see it? I'd made my choice about that once already, back on the shoulder of the coast road. And it had cost me. And it had paid off. Both at once, the way most hard choices do. Now Nadine was asking me to make a different version of that same choice. Not whether to expose her. That part was already done. Already moving through a system neither of us controlled anymore. She was asking whether I'd offer her mercy on the other side of the exposure. Whether the man she'd tried to erase from his own farm owed her one soft word to a judge who'd never met either of us before all this. "Nadine," I said finally, "I'm not going to lie for you. I won't stand up and say the marriage was something it wasn't, especially not at the end, but I'm not going to stand up and pile on to you either. What you did to me, you did with clear eyes, and you'll answer for that in whatever way the court decides is fair. That's not mine to soften or sharpen." "So you won't help me?" she said. And I heard the old brittleness creeping back into her voice, the sound of a woman already rehearsing how she'd tell this part of the story to herself later. "I didn't say that," I said. "I'll tell the truth if they ask me. That you were a good wife to me for years before any of this started. That I believe Vernon found you soft in a way he'd clearly learned to find in women before you. Women he'd studied and worked the same way he worked you. I'll tell them I don't think you set out 9 years ago to become a woman who forges her own husband's life out from under him. I think a patient, practiced man found the cracks in a marriage that already had some, and he worked them slow, the way water works stone, until you weren't the same person anymore. That's the truth as I understand it. I won't say more than that, and I won't say less." There was a long silence on the line. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the brittleness entirely. "That's more than I deserve," she said quietly. "Maybe," I said. "But it's what's true. And true is the only currency I've got left to spend on you, Nadine. I spent 3 months learning that the truth given time is worth more than anything either of us could forge." She was quiet a moment longer. "For what it's worth, Earl, I am sorry. Not for getting caught, I know that's what it probably sounds like. I'm sorry for what I let myself become, chasing something that was never real to begin with." I didn't know standing on that porch whether to believe her. I'm not sure I know it even now telling you this. But I chose in that moment to let the words sit, as they were neither accepted nor thrown back at her, because some things a person says at the end of a ruin like this aren't really meant for the person listening. They're meant for the person saying them. The beginning of whatever long accounting she'd have to make with herself in the years ahead, in whatever cell or courtroom or empty apartment those years turned out to hold. "Good night, Nadine," I said, and I ended the call. And I stood on that porch a long while, after looking out at land that was for the first time in nearly 2 years, entirely and only mine again. Nadine's case moved through the county court over the following winter slower than any of us expected, the way these things do. Her lawyer negotiated a plea in the end. Rather than risk trial on both counts, she pled guilty to the lesser charge, the one tied to structuring the transfers through the joint account, and the fraud count was reduced. In exchange, a deal Odell told me was fairly standard for a defendant with no prior record, and in his professional opinion, real cooperation with the investigation into Vernon. She avoided real prison time. 18 months probation restitution she'll likely be paying toward for years community service, and a felony record that will follow her the rest of her life, into every job application and background check she'll ever face again. I didn't attend the sentencing. Caleb went quiet in the back row because he said somebody from the family should see it through to the end. And he came home that evening and told me she'd cried when the judge read the terms, not loud, just steady tears down a face that had gone thin and gray over the months of waiting. I felt something when he told me. Not satisfaction, though I understand if that surprises you, just the particular ache of watching a life come apart that didn't have to. Built on a foundation that was never as solid as either of us believed it was, when we stood up together at a courthouse 9 years earlier, and promised each other things neither of us fully understood, yet how to keep. Bryn moved back to the farm that spring, into her old room. Temporary, she said, just until she got back on her feet, though 6 months later she was still there. Working the books now properly on the same computer Vernon had once used to learn the shape of my signature. She'd taken a bookkeeping course at the community college, the same one Caleb had gone to years before, and she was careful with the numbers in a way that told me she understood better than any of us exactly what it had cost when numbers went unwatched. I want to be able to catch it, she told me one evening, hunched over the ledger at that same kitchen table. If anything like this ever tries to happen again, to you or to anybody. I watched my daughter grow into that resolve over those months, and it was strange as it sounds to say about something born out of so much wreckage, one of the better things to come out of that whole ordeal. She'd trusted the wrong man once, badly, publicly, and instead of letting that shame curdle into something bitter, she'd turned it into a kind of vigilance the rest of us benefited from every single day. Trey and his wife kept their distance after that Saturday. I heard from a neighbor that Trey had taken to telling people around Eugene that he'd suspected Vernon all along, which wasn't true, but I let it go. Some men need a story they can live inside more than they need the truth, and I'd spent enough of my own life understanding the difference between the two to know it wasn't my job to strip that comfort away from every person who reached for it. He sent a card that Christmas, brief and awkward, the first communication from him in 8 months. I didn't answer it. Some doors you leave closed a while longer just to see if a man means it before you decide whether to open them again. Word got around the valley the way word does in a place like Tillamook, where everybody's known everybody's business for 4 generations. I braced myself for pity, or worse, for the particular small-town relish some people take in a neighbor's misfortune. What I got instead surprised me. Men I'd known my whole life started stopping by, unprompted, on some thin excuse about borrowing a tool or checking on a fence line, and staying to talk a while longer than the errand required. Marisol, who'd worked my milking parlor for 11 years and had watched the whole slow unraveling without ever once being asked her opinion of it, told me quietly one morning that she'd never trusted Vernon. Not from the very first Sunday he showed up at a branding with his sleeves rolled and his smile too ready. I asked her why she'd never said anything. "Wasn't my place, Earl," she said. "But I'm glad you finally saw what the rest of us saw a long time ago." The farm itself came back slow, the way everything worth having comes back slow. Odell helped me untangle the fraudulent loans from the legitimate ones, a process that took most of that winter and cost more in legal fees than I care to say out loud. But by spring, the farm credit union had cleared every dollar Vernon had borrowed in my name. The recorded liens against the north pasture lifted clean, the land itself, at least, entirely mine again. Cascade Ridge Holdings, the development company, never came back around. I imagine word travels fast in that business when a deal collapses into a criminal investigation, and whatever appetite they'd had for my creek and my cul-de-sacs and my bottomland disappeared along with Vernon. I still don't know where he is. I doubt I ever will. Detective Ruiz calls every few months, mostly out of professional courtesy at this point, to say the warrant's still active and the trail's still cold. And each time I thank her and hang up and go back to whatever I was doing. Because I learned somewhere in those 3 months of quiet waiting that a man can spend his whole remaining life chasing a ghost, or he can turn back to the work in front of him and let the ghost go wherever ghosts go. I chose the work. A year passed the way a year does on a dairy farm, marked less by the calendar than by the rhythm of the herd. Calving in late winter, breeding in spring, the long green stretch of summer grass, then the slow gray settle of fall rain that Tillamook is famous for. The same rain that's fed this valley since my great-grandfather first walked it with a mule and a shovel. I want to tell you honestly that the year wasn't all healing and steady rebuilding, because that wouldn't be true. And I've spent this whole story trying to give you the truth, even when the truth was slower and messier than a clean story usually allows. There were nights that first spring when I still woke at 2 in the morning out of old habit, some animal part of me still listening for a car in the drive that wasn't Vernon's, still bracing for a conversation that had already happened and finished and could never happen again. Grief doesn't care that the thing you're grieving deserved to be lost. It moves through you on its own schedule regardless. Odell came by more often than the legal work strictly required that first year, and I understood eventually that he'd become something closer to a friend than a lawyer, somewhere in the middle of it all, the two of us sitting on my porch some evenings, with nothing much to discuss beyond milk prices and the weather, content in the particular comfortable silence of 2 old men who'd been through something together and didn't need to keep talking about it to know it had mattered. Caleb moved his young family onto the property that year, into the old tenant house on the east side that had sat empty since I was a boy. And we drew up the papers properly this time. Real papers, Odell's careful hand on every line, naming Caleb as successor to the operation, the way my father had once named me. There was no forgery anywhere near those documents. Just an old man and his son, and a lawyer who'd known us both our whole lives, doing something honest in the light of day because it no longer needed to hide from anyone. I watched my son become, over that year, exactly the kind of steward this land has always needed. He modernized what needed modernizing, and left alone what didn't, the same balance my father struck and his father before him. And there were mornings I'd stand at the parlor door and watch him move among the herd with an ease that told me plainer than any document ever could, that Hollister Dairy was going to outlive every single one of us, the way land always does when it's tended right. His wife, a quiet, capable woman named Dana, who'd grown up on a berry farm 2 counties south, took to the place like she'd been born to it. And their little girl, not yet 2, spent her first summer chasing barn cats across the same ground where I'd once watched a stranger in city shoes unroll plans for a subdivision that would never exist. I'd stand at the fence some evenings and watch her toddle after those cats, and I'd think about how close we'd come to losing all of it. This exact, small, ordinary, precious scene to a man who'd never once cared what any of it actually meant to the people living on it. Bryn stayed on too, running the books now, with a precision that would have made Odell proud, cross-checking every statement against the credit union's own records twice a month, a habit born entirely out of what she'd lived through. She started seeing a young man from a neighboring farm that fall, a quiet, steady sort, who reminded me a little of myself at that age. And I watched my daughter laugh again, easy and unguarded, in a way I hadn't heard from her in over a year. And I understood that some wounds, given enough patient tending, really do close clean. I want to say something here about trust because it's the thing I've thought about most in the years since. More even than the money or the land or the wreckage of that marriage. Trust, I've come to understand, isn't a single door that's either open or shut. It's more like the rind on a good cheese built up slow in layers, each one thin and nearly invisible on its own, but together forming something that can actually hold against the world outside. Vernon didn't break down my door in a single afternoon. He found the door already standing open, the way I'd left it open for a man I'd called family for 40 years. And he walked through a little further each week, so patient and so slow that by the time I understood what was happening, he was already standing in the middle of my house, Rebuilding that kind of trust after doesn't happen in one grand gesture either. It happens the same slow way it was taken, one small, honest exchange at a time. Until eventually, you look up and realize the walls have grown back around you, thicker and wiser than before. Nadine, I heard through the county grapevine, had moved to a small apartment 2 towns over, working now at a retail counter, quietly serving out the terms of her probation. I never saw her again after that phone call the night before her arraignment. I don't imagine I ever will. There's a version of this story where I might have found some satisfaction in that, in the particular smallness of the life she'd traded a marriage and a farm to chase after something bigger and ended up with less than what she started with. But mostly when I think of her now, I just feel the same tired sorrow I felt on that porch step, watching a woman understand too late exactly what she'd let herself become. Vernon Pike was never found. The warrant sits open in 3 states, gathering the particular kind of dust that only unsolved things gather. And somewhere out there, I have to assume, he's already found some other soft place to press his weight, against some other family with an old man's shaking hands and a piece of land worth more than anyone in it understands. I think about that sometimes. The thought that he's still out there, doing to some other family exactly what he did to mine, and it's the one piece of this whole ordeal that still keeps me up some nights. The knowledge that patience like his doesn't retire. It just finds new ground to work. I've thought more than once about writing that other family a letter somehow, some warning flare sent out into the dark toward a farmhouse I'll never see. But a man can't warn strangers he doesn't know exist. And so instead, I've settled for warning the people right in front of me. My own children, my own grandchild, growing up in a house where the books get checked twice a month. Now where nobody ever again hands the whole shape of their trust to a single patient smile, without holding a little of it back in reserve. But I've made my peace with what I can't control. I learned that lesson slow, the same way I've learned most things worth knowing down in the cool dark of my cellar, watching something age at its own pace whether I willed it to or not. That's where I was this past December, on the 1-year anniversary of the night Odell walked through my kitchen door. I hadn't planned it that way. I'd simply gone down the way I go down most winter evenings to check the wheels and turn what needed turning, the old habit of 50 years still steady in my hands, despite everything they'd shaken through that year. The cellar was cold the way it's always cold, 54 degrees and steady. The smell of mold and stone and patient time settling around me. The moment I came down the old wooden stairs, I ran my hand along the shelves as I walked, the way I've done 10,000 times in my life. Past the 2-year cheddar that had aged right through the whole ordeal without ever once knowing what was happening in the house above it. Past the gap in the stone where a crock full of evidence had once sat waiting behind a rack of wheels, empty now returned to holding nothing more than brine. I stopped in front of a fresh batch I'd started that same week, back when the fog was still burning off the north field. Young cheddar barely a few days into its aging, still soft and pale, and nowhere near what it would eventually become. I lifted one wheel down and turned it in my hands, feeling the give of it, the rind not yet formed, the whole long, dark future of it still ahead. A year ago, almost to this same December week, I'd sat at my kitchen table and watched my wife slide a deed toward me and ask me to sign away 4 generations of this land. I'd picked up that pen with a betrayal sitting fresh and raw in my chest, and I hadn't known yet, not for certain, whether patience was going to be wisdom or just an old man's excuse for cowardice. I know now. I've had a year to turn it over the way I turn everything over down here in the dark. And I've come to believe something I want to leave you with, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. The world moves fast now. Everybody wants the answer today, the revenge today, the satisfaction delivered before the anger even has time to cool. But some of the most important things in a life, the truest things, they can't be rushed, no matter how badly you want them to hurry. You can't force a marriage to reveal its rot before it's ready. You can't force a liar to trip over his own lie before he's told enough of them. And you can't force trust to rebuild itself in a season. No matter how much you might want your daughter back, your land back, your peace back all at once. You put the thing up on the shelf. You salt it. You turn it when it needs turning. And then, God help you, you wait. I set that young wheel back on its shelf and I turned it a quarter turn, the way I have every week of my life. And I thought about Vernon Pike, out there somewhere, patient and hungry, already working some other family's soft places in the dark. I thought about Nadine, alone in a small apartment 2 towns over, learning slow what it cost to trade a real thing for a false promise. And I thought about my own family upstairs right now, warm and whole and finally entirely telling each other the truth. I climbed the stairs back up into the light, and I closed the cellar door behind me, and I went to go sit with the people who were left.